Who's really in the lift? In L.P. Hartley's Someone in the Lift, a young boy's festive hotel stay turns into a chilling encounter with the unknown. As he repeatedly glimpses a shadowy figure in the elevator, his parents' dismissals only deepen the mystery. The line between childhood imagination and genuine supernatural presence blurs, leading to a haunting climax that defies any easy explanation. Hartley's masterful storytelling weaves innocence, fear, and the uncanny into a tapestry of unease that clings to the mind like frost on a winter window. I am Tony Walker, and I welcome you to the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, where I will be reading Someone in the Lift by L.P. Hartley.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back.
Someone in the Lift by L.P. Hartley. There's someone coming down in the lift, Mummy. No, my darling, you're wrong, there isn't. But I can see him through the bars. A tall gentleman. You think you can, but it's only a shadow. Now you'll see. The lift's empty. And it always was. This piece of dialogue, or variations of it, had been repeated at intervals ever since Mr. and Mrs. Malden and their son Peter had arrived at the Brompton Court Hotel, where, owing to a domestic crisis, they were going to spend Christmas. New to hotel life, the little boy had never seen a lift before, and he was fascinated by it. When either of his parents pressed the button to summon it, he would take up his stand some distance away to watch it coming down. The ground floor had a high ceiling, so the lift was visible for some seconds before it touched floor level, and it was then, at its first appearance, that Peter saw the figure. It was always in the same place, facing him, in the left-hand corner. He couldn't see it plainly, of course, because of the double grille, the gate of the lift and the gate of the lift shaft, both of which had to be firmly closed before the lift would work. He had been told not to use the lift by himself, an unnecessary warning, because he connected the lift with the things that grown-up people did, and, unlike most small boys, he wasn't over-anxious to share the privileges of his elders. He was content to wonder and admire. The lift appealed to him more as magic than as mechanism. Acceptance of magic made it possible for him to believe that the lift had an occupant when he first saw it, in spite of the demonstrable fact that when it came to rest, giving its fascinating click of finality, the occupant had disappeared. "If you don't believe me, ask Daddy," his mother said. Peter didn't want to do this, and for two reasons, one of which was easier to explain than the other. "Daddy would say I was being silly," he said. "Oh, no, he wouldn't. He never says you're silly." This was not quite true. Like all well-regulated modern fathers, Mr. Malden was aware of the danger of offending a son of tender years. The psychological results might be regrettable. But Freud or no Freud, fathers are still fathers. And sometimes, when Peter irritated him, Mr. Malden would let fly. Although he was fond of him, Peter's private vision of his father was of someone more authoritative and awe-inspiring than a stranger seeing them together would have guessed. The other reason which Peter didn't divulge was more fantastic. He hadn't asked his father because when his father was with him, he couldn't see the figure in the lift. Mrs. Malden remembered the conversation and told her husband of it. "The lift's a dark place," she said, "and I dare say he does see something. He's so much nearer to the ground than we are. The bars may cast a shadow and make a sort of pattern that we can't see. I don't know if it's frightening him, but you might have a word with him about it." At first, Peter was more interested than frightened. Then he began to evolve a theory. If the figure only appeared in his father's absence, didn't it follow that the figure might be, could be, must be his own father? In what region of his consciousness Peter believed this, it would be hard to say, but for imaginative purposes he did believe it, and the figure became for him Daddy in the lift. The thought of Daddy in the lift did frighten him, and the neighbourhood of the lift shaft, in which he felt compelled to hang about, became a place of dread. Christmas Day was drawing near, and the hotel began to deck itself with evergreens. Suspended at the foot of the staircase, in front of the lift, was a bunch of mistletoe, and it was this that gave Mr. Malden his idea. As they were standing under it waiting for the lift, he said to Peter, "Your mother tells me you've seen someone in the lift who isn't there." His voice sounded more accusing than he meant it to, and Peter shrank. "Oh, not now," he said truthfully. "Only sometimes." "Your mother told me that you always saw it," his father said, again more sternly than he meant to. "And do you know who I think it may be?" Caught by a gust of terror, Peter cried, "Oh, please don't tell me." "Why, you silly boy," said his father reasonably. "Don't you want to know?" Ashamed of his cowardice, Peter said he did. "Why, it's Father Christmas, of course." Relief surged through Peter. "But doesn't Father Christmas come down the chimney?" he asked. "That was in the old days. He doesn't now. Now he takes the lift." Peter thought a moment. "Will you dress up as Father Christmas this year?" he asked, "even though it's an hotel?" "I might." "And come down in the lift?" "Why, yes, that's what it's for." After this, Peter felt happier about the shadowy passenger behind the bars. Father Christmas couldn't hurt anyone, even if he was, as Peter now believed him to be, his own father. Peter was only 6, but he could remember 2 Christmas Eves when his father had dressed up as Santa Claus and given him a delicious thrill. He could hardly wait for this one, when the apparition in the corner would at last become a reality. Alas, 2 days before Christmas Day, the lift broke down. On every floor it served, and there were 6, counting the basement, the forbidding notice, "Out of order," dangled from the door handle. Peter complained as loudly as anyone, though secretly he couldn't have told why. He was glad that the lift no longer functioned, and he didn't mind climbing the 4 flights to his room, which opened out of his parents' room but had its own door too. By using the stairs he met the workmen. He never knew on which floor they would be, and from them gleaned the latest news about the lift crisis. They were working overtime, they told him, and were just as anxious as he to see the last of the job. Sometimes they even told each other to put a jerk into it. Always Peter asked them when they would be finished, and they always answered, "Christmas Eve, at latest." Peter didn't doubt this. To him, the workmen were infallible, possessed of magic powers, capable of suspending the ordinary laws that governed lifts. Look how they left the gates open and shouted to each other up and down the awesome lift shaft, paying as little attention to the other hotel visitors as if they didn't exist. Only to Peter did they vouchsafe a word. But Christmas Eve came. The morning passed, the afternoon passed, and still the lift didn't go. The men were working with set faces and a controlled hurry in their movements. They didn't even return Peter's "good night" when he passed them on his way to bed. Bed! He'd begged to be allowed to stay up this once for dinner. He knew he wouldn't go to sleep, he said, till Father Christmas came. He lay awake, listening to the urgent voices of the men, wondering if each hammer stroke would be the last, and then, just as the clamour was subsiding, he dropped off. Dreaming, he felt adrift in time. Could it be midnight? No, because his parents had, after all, consented to his going down to dinner. Now was the time. Averting his eyes from the forbidden lift, he stole downstairs. There was a clock in the hall, but it had stopped. In the dining room there was another clock. But dared he go into the dining room alone, with no one to guide him and everybody looking at him? He ventured in, and there, at their table, which he couldn't always pick out, he saw his mother. She saw him too, and came towards him, threading her way between the tables as if they were just bits of furniture, not alien islands under hostile sway. "Darling," she said, I couldn't find you. Nobody could. But here you are." She led him back, and they sat down. "Daddy will be with us in a minute." The minutes passed. Suddenly there was a crash. It seemed to come from within, from the kitchen, perhaps. Smiles lit up the faces of the diners. The man at a nearby table laughed and said, "Something's on the floor. Somebody'll be for it." "What is it?" whispered Peter, too excited to speak out loud. "Is anyone hurt?" "Oh, no, darling. Somebody's dropped a tray, that's all." To Peter it seemed an anticlimax, this paltry accident that had stolen the thunder of his father's entry, for he didn't doubt that his father would come in as Father Christmas. The suspense was unbearable. "Can I go into the hall and wait for him?" His mother hesitated, and then said, "Yes." The hall was deserted. Even the porter was off duty. Would it be fair, Peter wondered, or would it be cheating and doing himself out of a surprise if he waited for Father Christmas by the lift? Magic has its rules, which mustn't be disobeyed. But he was there now, at his old place in front of the lift, and the lift would come down if he pressed the button. He knew he mustn't, that it was forbidden, that his father would be angry if he did. Yet he reached up and pressed it. But nothing happened. The lift didn't come. And why? Because some careless person had forgotten to shut the gates. Monkeying with the lift, his father called it. Perhaps the workmen had forgotten in their hurry to get home. There was only one thing to do. Find out on which floor the gates had been left open, and then shut them. On their own floor it was, and in his dream it didn't seem strange to Peter that the lift wasn't there, blocking the black hole of the lift shaft, though he daren't look down it. The gates clicked too. Triumph possessed him. Triumph lent him wings. He was back on the ground floor with his finger on the button. The thrill of power such as he had never known ran through him when the machinery answered to his touch. But what was this? The lift was coming up from below, not down from above. And there was something wrong with its roof, a jagged hole that let the light through. But the figure was there, in its accustomed corner, and this time it hadn't disappeared. It was still there. He could see it through the mazy crisscross of the bars, a figure in a red robe with white edges and wearing a red cowl on its head. His father, Father Christmas, Daddy in the lift. But why didn't he look at Peter? And why was his white beard streaked with red? The two grills folded back when Peter pushed them. Toys were lying at his father's feet, but he couldn't touch them, for they too were red, red and wet as the floor of the lift, red as the jag of lightning that tore through his brain. You might be one of those people like me who doesn't like the stories to be interrupted with ads. And this podcast has ads on it. However, there is a solution. If you would like access to the stories without ads and a link to a library of all the stories I've ever done that you can download without ads, you can get that by becoming a patron. So if you join for $5 or the equivalent in your currency a month, you can have all the stories ad-free. So consider becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/Barcud, BARCUD. So that was Someone in the Lift by L.P. Hartley. I've got to say, when I'm recording a story, the dogs are banned. Then I feel sorry for them. So there's two of them here now. Jasper's having a lie down. Callie's wandering around. Callie's very excited today. I don't really know why. But she boxes me when she's excited. She gets on her hind legs and tries to box me. I tell her not to, but she doesn't listen. Anyway, it's those of you who are serious-minded are sitting thinking, get on with the literary analysis. So I will. L.P. Hartley. Leslie Poles Hartley, CBE, was born on the 30th of December 1895 in Whittlesea, Cambridgeshire. And interestingly, he was named after Leslie Stephen, the father of Virginia Woolf, the very avant-garde Bloomsbury author. I'm not sure if his writing would have been... I don't know what they thought of his writing. He was a workaday writer. He was a successful novelist. You probably know that. Whether the Bloomsbury set thought he was highbrow enough, I don't know. Somebody might know. I'd be interested to find out. Hartley's father, Harry Bark Hartley, was initially a solicitor and justice of the peace near Peterborough. He later ran brickworks. So it's interesting how we get a few lines about somebody, we conjure a whole biography, and we're probably wrong. And when I was working in mental health, we would go and see patients in the community, or they would come into the hospital and they were in a crisis, and we'd have some already gathered information. Either they'd be seen before and we read the notes, or they were new and we'd have something from them, the referrer. And you would inevitably, and you can't help it, you would create an image of that person. What is that person like, from very little information? And when I had students, I'd say to them, this is what you're going to do. 90% of the time you're going to be wrong. Because sometimes you're right, maybe not 90, maybe 90 is a bit much. But so my point about saying this is, we have this idea of very traditional British male, a Victorian really. His father would be a Victorian, and mother, of course. So we get this idea, and I think that bear that in mind for the story. The mother, his mother, Mary Elizabeth, born Thompson, was known to be overly concerned about his health, which may have contributed to L.P. Hartley's lifelong hypochondria. We also know that Hartley, as a boy, was very fond of the work of Edgar Allan Poe. His early life was marked by frequent moves and changes in education. The family relocated to Fletton Tower near Peterborough. I said that wrong. During his childhood, he began writing stories at the age of 11. I think, do people who write always start writing? I remember writing stories as a little boy. I had a little book, and it was not the Borrowers, the Little Grey Men. That was the story, and there were these little dwarf guys, and they had they captured a toy boat, or they came across a toy boat. I don't remember the story now, and they were sailing down. Oh God, I loved those, and I used to write fan fiction. Really, I suppose you'd call it now. Set in their world when I was quite small. I mean, not quite small, not 3, but sort of maybe 8 or so, 9. Anyway, he started when he was 11. He maybe started earlier. Who knows? I mean, we've only got the corpus of the internet's mind to say that he started 11. He's not here to tell us. He might, if he was listening, he might say, no, I did a story about custard pie when I was 5. Just don't know. After a brief stint at other schools, he settled at Harrow School. So, his father, you got to have a few quid to send your son to Harrow. And he excelled in reading and English literature. During World War I, he attended Balliol College in Oxford to study modern history. He tried to join the army in 1916, but never saw active duty due to a weak heart. Did he have a weak heart or not? He lived... he was... How old was he? He was 79... He died in 72, born in 1895, so 79, that makes to me. And so he wasn't really that ill, was he? But anyway, he returned to Oxford in 1919 after trying to join the army. It took him 3 years to try to join the army. He must have got lost. Or he was very persistent. Or they were just waiting a long time for the test to come back that told him he had the war's finished now. Anyway, also, you couldn't have joined because you got a weak heart. Anyway, he made influential literary friends. So I think there's something here that I don't know about his literary connections. And I'm going to go and... I've missed that in my notes. I compile my notes and I write them all out. And be honest with you, I spend more time thinking about the story, because very often the biographies of the writers is a done deal. It's well known, but I've missed something out. So just wait a sec. Well, you might say Google is your friend, but these days Perplexity is my friend. That's a search engine I use, and I find it much more useful. If you haven't used it, you should try it. The only problem is if you ever want a login, just like if you want to log into, I don't know, custardpie.com, then it's no good because it'll give you an article about custard pies, whereas actually you just want the login link. There's ways around it, but I just don't. So I use Google for that. That may be a little useful tip for you. So the Bloomsbury Group, he was contemporaneous with the Bloomsbury Group, who were very avant-garde and included people like Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forster, John Maynard Keynes, of course, Lytton Strachey and people like that. A collective of artists and intellectuals who were very liberal about the arts, and they had progressive views on sexuality and open relationships. And it's noted that these contrasted with Hartley's more traditional perspectives. He had a particularly complicated relationship with Virginia Woolf. He expressed disdain for her work, even though he was named after her dad, and had a notably critical review of her novel The Waves. The animosity was mutual. Woolf once derisively commented on Hartley's writing style, suggesting he should change it. Despite attending gatherings at Garsington Manor, more of which later, hosted by Lady Ottoline Morell, a figure associated with both the Bloomsbury and the Garsington group, Hartley felt more aligned with the Asquith set. We'll come to who she is, Lady Cynthia Asquith. We're going to say something about her. Hartley's literary career began in earnest in later life. The Shrimp and the Anemone was published when he was 49. His most famous novel, The Go-Between, opens with the line, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." That is so famous, that line. And if you, I'd be astonished if you didn't know it, hadn't heard of it, even vaguely, or didn't know it was L.P. Hartley, but you probably did know it's from The Go-Between. Just drop in a conversation. It's just one of those things. You just kind of, if there's a lull in the conversation, just wait a second and look into the middle distance with your cup of hot chocolate in your right hand and say that the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. I think you can get away with it with most accents. Scouse. The past is a foreign country. They do things. No, that's a terrible accent. Sheila's been listening to a lot of this Scouse comedian. Scouse comedian. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Okay. I won't go on with all the different accents that you could do. So, his later works increasingly address themes of homosexuality, culminating in The Harness Room, 1971, which explicitly explores homosexual relationships. He died in 74, and so he lived to see the opening up of things like that, as Father Ted might say, that sort of thing. In the 70s, 60s and 70s. His pals, though, didn't like Virginia Woolf. Aldous Huxley, all this chrome yellow, but then later on, all the psychedelic stuff. And he was introduced to the Garsington set by Huxley and got to know Lady Ottoline Morell. And this connection allowed him to gain access to prominent literary circles. That's where I've been missing out. Cynthia Asquith, a significant figure in Hartley's life. Asquith was a writer and socialite who published some of Hartley's early works in her anthologies. I've done a story of her. She's done some nice little ghost stories. She was the editor of the Ghost book series. I think that was Fontana, might have been Pan. It's on my shelf. I just can't be bothered. I can Google something, but I can't be bothered to get up and wander over. Lord David Cecil, perhaps the most important relationship in Hartley's life. Cecil was a biographer and historian, and he had a deep bond. Their friendship included vacations together and a shared love for Venice. Hartley regarded Cecil's marriage as a betrayal, but they maintained their friendship throughout their lives. And then C.H.B. Kitchin, I don't really know him, a lifelong friend from Hartley's school days. Kitchin shared similar literary interests and backgrounds with Hartley. Their friendship provided Hartley with companionship and support within literary circles. And he was also allowed into aristocratic circles by a woman called Elizabeth Bibesco, another socialite and writer who supported him, helped him navigate the upper echelons of British society. So even though he went to Harrow and he would have known some top draw people there, But obviously he wasn't of them, was he? His dad ran a brickworks. It had some money, but it's not the right kind of money. In fact, it's not even money that counts. So, where were we? Back to my proper notes. Yeah, he was an editor and book reviewer. Remember, he didn't become famous for his own writing until much later. He started off in Ghost Stories, Night Fears in 1924. And that was Walter Dillon Mayer and M.R. James were famous for ghost stories, and they had a renaissance in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. His most famous book, as we said, is The Go-Between. There we are. Let's have a look at this story. Someone in the lift. Let me give you my feeling for it, first of all. I think it was promising. This is L.P. Hartley we're talking about. He wrote The Go-Between and other stories. This is a guy he was an editor. He knew what he was talking about when it came to writing. He could write. And we did one of his other stories, W.S., which was really good. I think this is good, but I was disappointed by the end, I've got to be honest. Okay, so it was first published in 1955 as part of the anthology The Third Ghost Book by the aforementioned Lady Cynthia Asquith. The story later appeared in Hartley's own collection, The Travelling Grave and Other Stories. Great title, The Travelling Grave. That's opened a loop, hasn't it? In 1948. That doesn't work, does it? I think that's backwards. So it must have been published in The Travelling Grave in 1948 and then republished in The Third Ghost Book in 55. So I didn't check I'm a bit date blind, to be honest. Oh, that's my excuse. Sheila always says to me, you use your ADHD as an excuse. And I go, yeah, but I got it though. And she goes, yeah, but you use it as an excuse. And I do. So there was a Tartarus press in 2001, a long time ago now. They produced the collected macabre, I believe you say, stories of L.P. Hartley, a 2-volume set which costs 80 quid. But I've got about 3 or 4 of their volumes. They are beautiful, beautifully done. They're based in North Yorkshire, in Leyburn or something like that. But they're beautiful, beautiful books, lovely hardback books. And you think, well, and what is a book for? It's for many things. One of the things you have it for is furnishing a room, yes, but also having the luxurious possession of it. So I suppose that's why somebody might spend 80 quid on 2. But listen, I've spent some money on the Tartarus books, about 40 quid a pop, So there we are. Must have been flush. I must have had a win on the horses that day. So someone in the lift, it. Short story, young boy staying with his family at an hotel. I should say this is going to come out mid-November 2024. Whenever you're listening to it, who knows? What's happened to the world since? Who knows? I don't know. If I did know, I'd be making more money on the horses if I could see the future. But yes. So I've lost my train of thought. Yeah, I'm in my Christmas production mode now. So I'll probably be chucking out Christmas stories. I've got 2 or 3 volumes of Christmas stories. I've got some Valancourt Christmas books, Christmas stories. They tend to be older. I've got some British Library versions. They tend to be old and new. The Sunless Solstice, Chilling Tale. I've got various collections of Christmas ghost stories, and then I pick from them, it's random why I picked them, really, apart from the Christmas. One of the things, I'm going to actually, funnily enough, be interviewed by 2 podcasts. There's a folklore podcast interviewing me, and I'm going to be talking about the tradition of Christmas ghost stories. And then somebody else is going to interview me also about the tradition of Christmas ghost stories, so I can use my notes, the same notes, but I'll kind of pitch it slightly differently, I think, so it makes it, so in case anybody listens to both. So the story, Christmas Eve, the lift breaks. There's something sinister about the lift. And I have 3 sections of thought about this. It's orderly. Freud. Now, I don't often do pure Freudian takes on stories. It was I think in the 20th century, the 2 main ways of analysing stories, the 2 critical lenses of literary analysis, the big beasts were, and then postmodernism comes towards the end of the 20th century, but were Freudian, psychoanalytical analysis and Marxist. I'm not going to do a Marxist one, and because I don't think it's appropriate for this. If it was, I would. So it struck me as being so Oedipal. This, the Oedipus complex, that the boy child loves the mother and sees the father as a rival. So in his childish mind, he wants to have the mother, and he realizes he's going to have to kill the father, or he's hostile. It makes him hostile to the father, but he's also, this is sort of Melanie Klein a little bit. Later development of the theory is frightened of the father's revenge. The father may destroy him before he can do it, so it makes him anxious about the father. So you can see that and if this is what I was saying about his own biography. We have a potentially over-involved mother. I remember what I said. We don't know very much about her, and we extrapolate from very few facts. But let's go with it, because why not? And we have a very traditional father who may be stern. He might not be. This father's not stern particularly, and that probably adds to the Freudian stuff. It's not that he has any real reason to be afraid of the father, but the boy is. There is some anxiety. His relationship with his father is not a smooth one. It's not a reassuring one, and but so we have the story about the lift. The lift goes two ways, doesn't it? It goes up and it comes down. Just stated the obvious there. Interestingly, it breaks. What does that say? The lift is somewhere he doesn't go on his own. We're told that. So it's an adult thing. We're told that, and it's mediated by the world of the adults, his father and his mother. He never sees Father Christmas in a lift when his father's with him. So it is, in fact, a projection of some kind of his father, isn't it? And his father, we're told explicitly, he dresses up as Father Christmas, which is both delicious and odd. We come into the idea of the uncanny there, the uncanny valley, etc., which is, in essence, a Freudian idea, but it's been developed. So Freud's idea was that the things we don't like the fact that we, or the Oedipus complex, are pushed into our subconscious, and we use a lot of energy, libido, to keep them there, but they come back. But they can't come back in the repressed form, so they come back in slightly different forms, so they come back nearly the same. That familiarity, which is almost the same, has a tinge of anxiety with it, and it's uncanny. It's uncanny. So the Father Christmas and the figure are both kind of uncanny doubles of his father. They're representations of his father who he has repressed, and he's pushed his father away, but his father's coming back. China dolls do it. The uncanny valley, invasion of the body snatchers. Things are almost right, but not quite right. There's other theories about that, and one of the other theories about this, and I'm going to go on a tangent which isn't totally germane to my main point, but the tangent is this: that when we peg somebody, that is to say, when we know who they are, put them in a hole, we know who they are, and we can predict them. That's old Joe. Old Joe eats peanuts and scratches his nose. We know who he is, we can predict him, he becomes safe because we can predict what he's going to do. If old Joe starts behaving slightly oddly, or he looks like old Joe, but there's something about him that isn't old Joe, we can't predict him anymore. It becomes a wild card, it becomes potentially dangerous. So that's another way, a non-Freudian way of looking at how things are nearly right, nearly copies, are worrying. One is that it's the return of the repressed in the Freudian sense. The other is that it's not quite predictable. Anyway. So, he goes into so the other thing that happens is he dreams this. So the lift is broken, the working men are fixing it, but they're struggling to fix it. This might be his rational mind trying to maintain this symbol of a contraption that brings things up and down from the unconscious to, in a Freudian sense. You know, the three levels of Freudian mind are the id, which is the instinctual stuff, the ego, which is where we sit, and the superego, which is often our dad or some authority figure telling us how we should behave, as a Freudian sense. So, in a sense, maybe this may be a stretch. The lift moves up and down, but it's broken. So there's some kind of psychic disturbance. I don't mean that in a woo-woo sense. I mean that in a Freudian sense. In the psyche, there's a disturbance which would cause anxiety, and it does in the boy. Now, the dream sequence. So he's being allowed into the adult world. All children. Another thing, this is Erickson really, about the stages of life. When I was working in mental health, I would say, so the idea is this: all of us we go through stages. When we're small, we have to learn to be ourselves. Then we become children from being infants. And when we're very small, the focus of our life is the family, is our family group. And then as we go into the world, we go to school and things like that, we need to pivot out so that our focus is not the family group. And in adolescence, the focus becomes the peer group. So teenagers are massively. So the first challenge we have is as a small child going to school. This is the separation anxiety. Our security is in our mother and father, or our mother very often, and we become very frightened when we're taken away from her. Then we negotiate that. So all my patients were at some stage, from the very little ones who were very scared, and I'll talk about the other ones as we go up. So, and then the next thing is to negotiate being acceptable to the peer group. As an adolescent, you must be acceptable to the peer group, and that causes massive anxiety. Think of Mean Girls, fitting in, being acceptable, and you can fail that, and that causes tons of anxiety. And then the next is finding a mate, and that causes tons of anxiety. And then it is creating, the next one about that is having the children and raising the children. And then we have that thing that happens very often, particularly for men in their 40s, whereby perhaps it happens to women as well. I mean, I think DNA evidence is coming out showing from all those ancestry kits is showing that female cheating was much more prevalent historically than we ever guessed, because women would have a high state, and I don't want to get into this, but have another man, let's say, another man's child, and he would be brought up by their solid partner, who they were a bit bored of possibly, but and the other man were perhaps giving genes that offered something else. And then the next thing is, of course, the children leave home, and you have to kind of work out, what am I for now? And the next thing is about finishing work, and you're like, oh, what am I for now? And then the next thing is approaching death, and how do I manage this? And all these stages, you can get stuck at them in Freudian sense. Freud was all about development and how you could get stuck. But this idea of stages is really another psychologist called Erickson, and I saw this all the time. Nearly everybody I saw with mental health difficulties, and I'm not talking about schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or dementia, I'm talking about anxiety, neurosis, anxiety, really, depression, were often, it's not the only cause of those things, but was often the reason that brought people to see me. So this little boy is negotiating the turn. He's not quite negotiating the turn towards the outside world, but he's beginning that. So who does his mother belong to is the question, I suppose. So that's the Freudian analysis. Let's have a think about, I want to say something about, and I've got 4 thoughts, in fact, about Robert Aikman. So Robert Aikman, you probably guess I'm a big fan of Robert Aikman. Robert Aikman, writing in the middle of the 20th century, just a generation probably after Hartley here, he excels at a similar thing that Hartley's doing, and Hartley does, is naturalistic weirdness. So there are two traditions, and I think we're in a world now where most books, many books, are non-naturalistic. They have supernatural elements, they have fantastical elements, they have weird elements, But in the 20th century, Jasper's having a dream. He's wagging his tail. I don't know why. In the 20th century, serious books were realistic. This guy writes serious books, but he also writes ghost stories. So how do you have this naturalistic world of the lift, of the workman, of the hotel, and the mummy and the daddy? It's all very naturalistic. How do you, and Aikman does this as well, his characters live in a very naturalistic world, but things go weird. And this is what happens in this story, of course. Aikman just has them go weird. Think of the hospice. Think of, the weirdness of the hospice, which is about a hotel, which makes me think of this. And the comparison between the two stories. Hartley introduces a dream scene to allow the weirdness in. He just doesn't have weirdness. And I think if he was somebody like Thomas Ligotti, and I pick on Thomas Ligotti because he's the king of the weird. He's the modern weird lord, I think. There are other people as well, but he is weird. He has characters wandering around bizarre towns at night, where going to concerts or going to see bands that or musicians that think very, very odd things happen. So his just happen. They go into weirdness. Laird Barron as well. I've read a lot of weird Laird Barron stories. But Hartley has to introduce a dream sequence. I don't know if that was a weakness. It was like context switching. But then charitably, we might say that for a child, the boundary between fantasy and realism isn't as drawn as for us. They believe in Father Christmas, they believe in the Tooth Fairy, they believe in unicorns, and they believe in magic. Maybe they're right. So that was like the dream sequence. Not sure about that. The next thing is about the bloody Father Christmas, and I'm not swearing there. Do you know bloody comes from By Our Lady? As goodbye comes from God be with ye. It's run down, God be with ye, By Our Lady, there we are. So, you maybe did know that. So, blood, and my notes say, is associated with sacrifice and renewal. What we're talking about is the solstice, is the ancient turning of the year towards better times. Father Christmas is in red. It's blood-coloured anyway. We could argue that this is a sign of the boy's transformation. This is coming up. The lift comes from below, and there's a hole in it. It's a hole down into the unconscious. I'm actually becoming a little bit more Jungian here than Freudian, to say the contents of the unconscious are coming up from the unplumbed depths and bringing quite shocking and frightening things with them, but I think jumping back neatly back to Freud, maybe not so neatly, this is the boy's fear of his father's revenge for him being alone with a mother, perhaps. What was all that about the tray being dropped? It's a fear of punishment, isn't it? Somebody says somebody will be for it, and in the boy's sense, he'll be for it. He has somehow transgressed. He's been with his mum, his dad isn't there, so he's going to be punished for stealing time with the love object. The ending, the ambiguous ending. Well, it is ambiguous. So Father Christmas doesn't come out and eat the boy up or kill him, or he doesn't jump up and down and go, ta-da, it's just your old dad. There is no resolution there. Is it good or bad? I was dissatisfied. I've written a few ambiguous endings myself. And it is a trick that we use. I'm reminded of the end of series 2 of Twin Peaks, which back in the 90s, which ended with so many open plots that you're like, oh. And these are, of course, I've talked about cognitive loops, and everybody talks about closing loops. Basically, somebody, a curiosity gap opens a loop in our head. A question is raised, either formally or through imagery, and we're like, what happens next? That's what we want to know. Who does what? Who does what happens? What happens? So these are questions, and we feel anxious until those questions are resolved. And we can kind of help out, soothe our anxiety by answering the questions ourselves. Yeah, it was a murderous Father Christmas. Your father hates you. He's going to kill you, possibly going to eat you, in fact. I think that's the real worry at depth. But it isn't resolved. Is that a good story ending? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. So on the one hand, I'm like, this is LP Hartley. Come on. He knows what he's talking about. And he does. So surely he knew what he was doing with the story ending. So surely it must be great and I'm just not getting it. Yeah? Or it might not be great. You shall be the judges. Anyway, I've rambled on a bit in that one. A few asides, a few dog comments. Jasper's finished his dream now. He's still asleep. Callie, I don't know where she's gone. She's gone downstairs. She gets bored with me, because I'm doing this, and she kind of looks at me for a minute. She's like, oh, what's he doing? He's boring. I want to box with him, but he won't box with me while he's talking to that wall, because that's what she thinks I'm doing. They think I'm crazy. They think I talk to a wall for ages. Anyway, Merry Christmas. It's not my Christmas yet, but this is me ramping up the Christmas stories. I think it's a really interesting story. Clearly, I've been able to talk about it for like a million years. Well, I exaggerate. 30 minutes maybe. So there's something to be said about it. I think, and that's always the great thing about all of these stories. There's something to be said about them. If there's nothing to be said about them, what's the point reading them? But the fact that this can raise so many questions and so many interesting points shows it deserves its place in the canon of ghost stories, of Christmas ghost stories particularly. But it wasn't particularly Christmas. It almost was Christmassy. We can imagine the hotel being decked out for Christmas, and the big Christmas meal, and you're going to have turkey, you're going to wear one of those hats of paper, and you're going to blow those things. But it wasn't quite Christmassy. Me, I prefer a Christmassy Christmas ghost story. But you can't always have what you want. Anyway, I'll be back again next week. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments what you think about A, I'm particularly interested in the Bloody Father Christmas, and B, the ending. Did it work for you?